Big day of news on this Monday, y'all. Lauren Sisler here with AL.com. And guess what? The SEC has released its full schedule for all 14 teams, as just announced on the SEC network. AL.com's Matt Scalici joining me now to break down the schedule for the Alabama Crimson Tide. And woo, Matt, what a day. I mean, I don't know about you. Before we pop up, what are the feelings going on right now? I mean, the schedule's out. We're getting a little bit closer to the realness of it.
It definitely feels more real. It's still so strange. Everything obviously about this offseason is unfamiliar to us and weird. And right down to the release of this schedule, this is just not the way we're used to finding out about this stuff. We're used to having the entire offseason to prepare for a schedule that's been set years in advance. And, it's weird finding this stuff out, basically about a month before it's going to happen. So, but that's the year we're living in. Everything is unprecedented and unpredictable.
Yeah, it's kind of like the college football playoff reveal when they're obviously revealing the teams. They're just sitting here watching the TV, and I'm just like, what is happening? And literally right now, August 17th. All right, so Patrick, our producer, pop up the schedule for us so we can take a quick look at that. This sort of gives you an idea of the 2020 season. September 26th will be the kickoff of the season. Then you got October, November, December. The season extending, as you can see, on into December 19th will be the SEC championship. So Alabama getting the bye week going into that championship game. So that'll be a little different. So we're going to talk about some of the nuances and some of the differences and, maybe the pluses and minuses for the schedule for the Alabama Crimson Tide. And so, Matt, let's just start off the top. Just sort of your initial thoughts when you saw all 10 games for Alabama being released.
Well, the first thing that jumps out to me is that it's how weird it is that there's a game after the Iron Bowl. I can only think of one other time I take that back. I can think of 3 other times since I've been paying attention to all this where Alabama had a game after the Iron Bowl. There was the 2 times that they played Hawaii when they were banned from playing in a bowl game. And then there was a game that was basically a makeup game against Southern Miss back in 2001 because of 9/11. So that right there tells you the extraordinary nature of this season, that we're talking about 3 years where things were very unusual and weird. And that's what it takes to get a game other than the Iron Bowl to end the season for Alabama. So it's going to feel weird. I think it's going to be hard for people to really get up and get excited about Arkansas the week after the Iron Bowl. But you got to do what you got to do to make it work, I guess. But that's really the only thing that sticks out at me that's just completely bizarre. I mean, I think the rest of it actually, and we can go through it, Lauren, but the rest of it actually kind of, I don't think sets up terribly for Alabama. I don't think Nick Saban would hate this schedule.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, looking at this schedule, there's nothing about it that I'm just like, ooh. Now, of course, the one that we were sort of waiting for, me personally, obviously, is when does Alabama play Georgia? Because you add them to the schedule this season, of course. They host, Alabama gets to host Georgia, so they come to Georgia. And then, of course, they go on the road to LSU. So those are really the 2 big games outside of the Iron Bowl that you're kind of looking at to kind of highlight the schedule and sort of be like, okay. And so I think to me, that Georgia game being kind of early in the season, I think is good. I mean, I think it kind of sets a barometer. I think it's good for that kind of level of competition early in the season. And honestly, I was just listening to Reese Davis work and I share some of the same sentiments. This is something for a lot of these coaches, this is like a dream come true, right? That we're sitting here, a conference only schedule and, really the competition, every single week, there's not going to be a week that we're just sitting here like twiddling our thumbs thinking like, man, there's been weeks during college football where, and I'm talking across every Power 5 conference, where you literally have maybe one like marquee matchup on the schedule. And it's just like, all right, derp. So I think that it's really interesting because I don't think there's any snooze fest going on here based on this SEC schedule that I'm seeing. And especially for Alabama, I think it's a good lineup.
Well, certainly Nick Saban has been advocating for more SEC games for many years. And I think his argument is ultimately he learns a lot more about his team when they play against better competition. And I think that's certainly true when you're talking about those games against FCS opponents. I think they do what they can in those kinds of games, but I don't think Nick Saban really feels like they get a whole lot out of that. I think for the most part, it is a little bit of a wash. And so there are none of those this year. There are games, the worst games on Alabama's schedule this year are still against teams that have talent that can challenge Alabama, and that they will not be able to most likely just, trot their starters out there and have them kind of half-heart their way through the game and not really have to try and not really learn anything about themselves. So I think there are going to be other coaches in the SEC that don't feel as strongly about this, especially if it turns out that we make it through the whole season and bowl eligibility becomes a factor. I think there will be some programs that don't feel great about the fact that it went this way. But if you're Alabama, if you're LSU, if you're Georgia, and you really want to test your players and get them into championship condition, this is what you want to see, and this is what you want to get your guys into.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a big question. And I think the coaches in some of these opening press conferences have kind of addressed this. We're in this unique situation too, with fall camp being a lot different. They haven't really gotten to see these guys. They didn't get to see these guys during spring. They didn't really get to see them perform. So I think depth is going to be a big key in building that depth. And of course, we know Nick Saban is huge on fundamentals. And so how much of that have they been able to implement during this off without having spring ball, without having the opportunity to really kind of hone in on that, so it's going to be a lot of playing catch up. And so for Alabama, especially opening, the week on the road at Missouri, I think is a very interesting matchup. I think we kind of laughed about it a week ago when certainly the matchups came out and who those, I guess, non-conference or I guess
the two extra games,
the two extra games, the non-divisional opponents were going to be, and that Missouri kind of gets like the crap end of the stick here, right?
Right.
Am I allowed to say that?
Well, we're live, so you said it. Yeah.
So now I'm giggling. So I think that for Alabama, I think this is a great draw for them. Obviously, a road game, is not always the best thing, but Alabama plays at a neutral site pretty much every year to open the season. So I don't think this is anything weird for them, strange for them. Obviously, traveling a long distance, kind of interesting. But, for the most part, going to Missouri, I've been there quite a bit. I'll tell you, Missouri, though, is extremely hot, in those opening weeks of the year. I think last year I was there.
About them.
Yeah, I was there like week 2 and I was like, oh my gosh, I am literally melting into the turf right now. And so, but Alabama's kind of used to that too. So I don't see that being a problem, but, I think that kind of jumps off to me, most certainly. In terms, Matt, I want to kind of get your take. If you're looking at this schedule right now, where would you say, like, if you could pinpoint like maybe a 3-game stretch, where do you see kind of the most difficult path for them if you had to kind of break that down?
That's why I say I think this really lines up well for Alabama, and why I think Nick Saban's probably pretty pleased with this schedule. Because if you look, and Patrick did a really good job here designing this this graphic of the schedule, because you can see the red highlighted games are the road games, and you can see they're pretty well spread out on this schedule. So there's not really any just real killer stretches where Alabama's having to spend multiple weeks on the road at all this season. I would say it's pretty tough out the gate here. I would say that probably if you had to pick a 3-game stretch, it's probably going to be that Texas A&M at home, at Ole Miss, and then home against Georgia. I think that's going to be pretty challenging. Now, obviously, Ole Miss is going to be in the first year under Lane Kiffin, but there's some talent there, and we know that Lane is going to be very motivated to coach a strong game against Nick Saban in that one. So, and then, that's kind of the sandwich game in the middle of really arguably 2 of the most talented rosters and most experienced rosters that Alabama's going to have to play this season. Maybe the 2 most experienced teams Alabama's going to play, between Texas A&M and Georgia. So I think that's a really tough stretch. I think, you could argue back and forth between whether you want to get teams like that early in the season before they really have a chance to get their their feet under them and get into midseason shape. But those are going to be that's a very important stretch for Alabama, and I think we're going to know a lot about what this team is by the time we get to the end of October and we've reached that sort of midway bye week there, leading into the LSU game. And really, Lauren, you look at the back half of that schedule. You've got a bye heading into the road trip to LSU, which is obviously a huge challenge to have to face, but at least you get that bye week of preparation going into it. Then you get Kentucky at home coming off of that, which frankly I think is probably a little more favorable for Alabama than what they usually have to deal with the week after LSU, which is a very physical Mississippi State team that we've seen, beat up Alabama the last several years coming off of those LSU games. You get the Iron Bowl still the week of Thanksgiving. Nothing new there. It's in Tuscaloosa. I think regardless of the all-time record, I think Alabama would rather be playing that game in Tuscaloosa than Auburn. Mm-hmm. And then you get this game against Arkansas, and motivation-wise, that might be one of the trickier ones, just because the team is going to feel like they've already played for everything they can play for by the time they get to that game. But if you're looking at it overall, I don't know that there's really any just brutal multi-week stretches where it's just going to be hard for Alabama to get themselves, recovering from the previous game or ready for whoever's next.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I think that this schedule to me is very favorable for Alabama. Obviously, we knew the opponents and what that schedule was going to look like with the addition of Georgia on the schedule, of course. And then you have Kentucky on the schedule, but to your point, first of all, the end of the season, you go into the Iron Bowl, you're kind of revved up. You're obviously like hitting the top of the mountain. And then you sort of get that Arkansas game to kind of, I guess breathe a little bit. Then you get the bye week, of course, and then SEC championship game. So obviously I think that works well in their favor. One thing I think will be really interesting as we sort of see how things unfold here. A few weeks of camp, and of course we'll have more kind of a breakdown of that as that comes forward. We are seeing a handful of guys starting to opt out of the season, and so I think that as we're sort of breaking down the rosters, and breaking down sort of what the landscape for each football team is, and that's kind of the interesting part, because I think we're really starting to rev up on the analysis of each team. But there's still a lot of news coming out about guys opting out. And so to me, that's going to be a very interesting storyline, because, an LSU team or a Georgia team or, an Ole Miss team for that matter, with guys opting out, it's going to look a whole lot different when you've got your star players, even if it's 2 or 3 of them that decide they don't want to play. And so to me, that is going to be a massive storyline going into this. And really, I just don't think that we can quite have a strong enough gauge on this each opponent until we really have all of those sort of numbers in play. And then not to mention when protocols go into place and we get 3 weeks into the season, let's say, and, your first and second string quarterback or wide receiver or running back or star player ends up with COVID and has to quarantine and sit out, that changes the whole dynamic again.
Absolutely.
And so I think these are the things that I'm sitting here in my mind, we can analyze the schedule all day long, strength of schedule at the start of the season. This is what we have, but this can all literally just like off the tracks very quickly. And that's not to say that, I'm predicting a shutdown of the season, but what I mean by that is that a team could look totally different in week 1 than week 5. And we're not just talking about them improving and obviously getting their legs under them that we often see in college football, where guys have to get into a rhythm. It's so much more than that, and variables that are going to play into this.
Yes, and what you're describing is chaos, and there is always a little bit of chaos involved in the college football season. It always plays a role in how the season plays out, but it's going to play a bigger role this year than it ever has in our lives. And everybody, I hope, is mentally prepared for that. I think if you're not already, you probably haven't been paying attention, but I think, you should expect for unexpected things to happen and disrupt the flow of this season. And I hope everybody keeps in mind and remembers that as important as this is to all of us, and as important as it is to our communities and businesses in our state, and it is very important, ultimately, people have to remember that this is a sport and it is a game, and people's lives will continue outside of this sport, particularly individual players. If they decide to pursue this entire season and continue with the whole thing, sometimes somebody's going to say it's not worth the risk to me. And as Nick Saban has been talking about in his press conference just a few minutes ago, everybody on the team and within the organization has total respect for that. And, hopefully the fans will do so as well, because it's going to be an intensely personal decision for everybody. And it's going to be a factor in how this team plays out and how the 2020 football season plays out. Even though we always like to talk about putting team over self, there are different stakes now, and we could be talking about people staying healthy and staying alive. So it's a different situation, and I think there are going to be some moments where we say this just doesn't feel like a normal football season at all, because key players just aren't available for huge games. And it's going to be really easy, I think, to feel as a fan like it's not fair to your team, like someone has let you down, like something's conspiring against your team, because that's what fans tend to go to when things don't go their way. But again, I hope that everybody keeps in mind there are a lot of factors happening that don't have anything to do with who wins and loses a football game. So it's going to be a weird season. We're hopeful that it's as safe as possible and that everybody gets to enjoy this as much as we possibly and reasonably can, without COVID becoming a huge factor. But there's no real way for us to know just how much of a factor it will be right now.
Yeah, well said, Matt. I think you really kind of hit the nail on the head, because it is a personal decision, and a lot of guys are having to make that decision not only for themselves but also for their families and their future. And so, I think that that's the key here, is just having that respect for everyone, all people involved. It's a lot of decision making. Man, being Greg Sankey right now, and obviously being a president of a university and having to be in their shoes, I just cannot even imagine what they've had to endure. And it continues. Like the narrative is not over. The story here is not over. This is going to be an ongoing thing. And we even heard from Bill Hancock about the college football playoff. That is also still in play as of right now. But that could look totally different, because right now we're sitting here with two Power 5 conferences that anticipate playing in the spring. What does that look like? Do we still have a college football playoff that gets played at the beginning of January? Is it a split, a split champion? How, there's so many different variables, but I think the key here is, first of all, we just got to get there. And so I think that each and every week, this will be very telling these next couple of weeks as players are back on campus. I feel like, the pretty transparent about sort of the results that have come in, how they're testing, how many positive, sort of what those numbers look like. And I think that, the key is going to be, getting these first few weeks under our belts to kind of see how that plays out, just like we've seen in the professional league, right? Obviously with baseball and, hockey, and then kind of a totally different, storyline there. But all that to say, this is a critical time these next few weeks to sort of see how that goes. And then from there, I think once we roll out the week one carpet, you're just kind of, holding onto your seat each and every week to sort of see how things play out.
And Nick Saban did mention the college football playoff and said, look, we don't really know, but that's going to be, you mentioned the idea of guys deciding to forego the season and not play. The truth of the matter is the college football playoff, and whether it ends up happening or not, is going to be a factor in those decisions.
I agree.
And Nick Saban said that's one of the questions he's been asked by some of his players. Nobody that we know of has opted out of the season for Alabama as of yet. But one of the things they're asking Nick Saban apparently is, are we going to get a chance to play for a championship? And it changes the evaluation in your head that you're making of, is this worth it to me? winning a championship is very important. It's why a lot of the guys who were at Alabama went to Alabama. So if they find out we don't have an opportunity to actually win a national championship or play in the playoffs, that could definitely set off a wave of decisions from guys who say, you know what, it's not worth it to me to continue this, so I'm just going to hang it up for the rest of the season. So it's, again, a lot of that is going to be dependent on things that the league has relatively little control over and can't predict right now. Maybe the numbers continue to look better and better as they have started to the last few weeks. Maybe they don't. Maybe kids coming back on campus causes that to spike, and this goes the opposite direction than we're all hoping. So there's just no real way for us to know right now. And this is going to be a story that us at AL.com and everybody else that covers these teams is just going to have to keep up with on a week-to-week basis. It's going to be really hard to make long-term projections that don't make you look like an idiot later. And that's just, look, my predictions on the best of years are usually pretty bad and don't hold up very well over the course of the season. But they're going to be really bad this year because things are going to change so quickly. So I think it's just going to be one of those situations where when you ask us, we can tell you what things look like right now. I don't know that we can, with a great amount of confidence, tell you what things are going to look like 3 weeks from now. And that's just kind of how it's going to be this year.
Heck, if you ever told me that right now on August 17th that we would be doing Zoom press conferences with our head football coaches to start fall camp 10 days late.
Yep.
I'd tell you were crazy. So many unknowns, but I appreciate the analysis, the breakdown, Matt. Obviously, great insight. And of course, we'll continue to have those updates. Fall camp will this week. Obviously, today, the first day, Nick Saban press conference. You can also see that here on the AL.com Alabama Facebook page, YouTube page, and we'll have some of that on Twitter as well. So please check out all of our social channels for that. And of course, a special shout out to our inline lighting sponsor. We appreciate the backing there. And of course, again, a wild time we're living in, but just excited to have this schedule. We'll continue to keep an eye on it and see how things go. So appreciate it, Matt. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren.